first 4 books of the New Testament are often referred to as the Gospels. Now, we need to just identify the understanding of what that word gospel means. Gospel, of course, comes from Anglo-Saxon, the language called Anglo-Saxon, which was the precursor to what we call English. And so gospel comes from Godspel, which translated into English today would be called good news. And of course, the good news comes from a Greek word, which is the word euangelion, which means the good message or the good news that will be presented. And so those 4 particular books of the Bible were called the Gospels because they contained within them the good news as was understood by the early church. But it was always called according to someone. So it was the Gospel according to Mark, or the Gospel according to Luke, or the Gospel according to Matthew or to John. In each time, what they're saying is that each of the writers, therefore, had a particular slant or particular way of seeing that good news, the good news that they wanted to share. And because they saw it in a particular way, that's what determined their writing. Now, what we're going to do in this module is to look at what we call the Synoptic Gospels. So the word synoptic, and synoptic obviously comes from Greek as well, and so it comes from 2 Greek, syn, which is together, and optic, which means to see. And so synoptic gospels means that they see together. Now what does that mean? Well, essentially what it means is that the first 3 gospels, so that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell roughly the same story, using roughly the same timeline and chronology. Now, you hear me saying the word roughly over and over. And the reason for that is because there's obviously differences between even the first 3 Gospels. Even though that they roughly tell the same story, they tell it in a different way. They use different methods for telling the story, and sometimes even use completely different stories to make it up. Now, the problem there is then which one's the correct one. And so the fact is it is a problem. And that's what we call it. We call it the Synoptic Problem. And the Synoptic Problem is really a collection of different issues, of different questions that surround the makeup and the development of the Synoptic Gospels. One of the biggest questions that is involved in the issue of the Synoptic Problem is where did the writers get their information from? Now, from the New Testament Intensive, you may remember that we looked through the development of the New Testament, about how the New Testament came to be the particular books that we have today. And you would have remembered that I would have said in that stage that one of the things that we begin with are the oral tradition. So the oral tradition would have been the first number of years of the Christian faith. Is that instead of writing stories down, because writing was still something which was more for the elite than for the ordinary, what would have happened was people would have remembered the stories and then would have told the stories to subsequent people. So Peter would have come into a church somewhere in Israel or in Judea and say things like, well, I remember when Jesus was with us and this particular thing happened. And he would then relate the story. And what would happen is the people who would be listening would then in turn relate the story to others. And so the stories of Jesus, the words of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, the sermons of Jesus would slowly but surely have traveled around in an oral tradition. We know that the first writings of the New Testament happened around about 45 AD. And it's by Paul himself that Paul writes letters to the various churches that he has established, or to churches that he wants to have a relationship with. But the gospel writings are a little later, most probably up to 30 years after the time of Jesus. Now, so for 30 years, what we have are these oral traditions, these oral stories about Jesus. And then we believe that the first gospel is Mark, not Matthew as it is in your New Testament. In fact, the fact that Matthew is first in your New Testament comes from one of the ancient theologians, a theologian by the name of Augustine. Augustine believed that Matthew was first and that the other Gospels were written after Matthew, and in fact used Matthew as a reference. Most scholars today would disagree with that. Most scholars today would believe that Mark was the first Gospel. and that Mark writes his gospel round about 65 AD. We're going to get into some of the realities of this just now, but what you need to understand is that Mark most probably is first, and then the others use him as the template. The problem that arises is that there is differences between each of the Gospels. There's some things that are only in Mark. Now, admittedly, that's the smallest amount. Only about 3% of Mark is not in the other two synoptic Gospels. However, there's much more of Mark, or things missing out of Mark, that are in Matthew and in Luke. There's some things that are both in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And then there's some things that are in Matthew and some things that are in Luke, but aren't in any of the others. Now, how do we account for that? Well, that concept of where the sources come from is part of the synoptic problem. So if we think of it this way, we've got Mark. And we could say, well, where did Mark get his sources? Well, possibly he got them from some of the disciples, most probably Peter, but he would have collected from some of those collections, those oral traditions, and then some of those collections that were written down, they may be collected together, and he used some of those as his particular source. But from him comes Matthew and Luke. So we can see that Matthew and Luke use roughly the same outline, the same chronology as Mark does. But they add things to it. And so there's a big conjecture now about where did they get the things that they have added. One of the things that many of the scholars have devised is this concept called Q, or quell, which means just other writings. And what they're saying is that there was this collection of writings which contained some of the sermons and some of the parables of Jesus. And what happened is that Matthew used Q to add things to his gospel, and Luke used things in Q for his gospel. And therefore the concept where these two are the same comes from what was in Q, and where they're different comes from Q as well. That's called the two-source hypothesis, or the two sources for Matthew and Luke. So the two sources would be Q and Mark. Of course, theologians can never leave simple alone, and they have to get more complicated. And what they've done is there's now also a four-source hypothesis, and that is that Matthew had his own source called M, and Luke had his own source called L. That's called the four-source hypothesis. Now, I know by this stage you're saying, well, what difference does it make if there was one source or two sources or 15 sources? What difference does it make? The only difference it makes is in the way in which we interpret the Bible, is the way in which we also understand the motivation of Matthew and Luke and Mark in terms of what they wrote. Because what they wrote, therefore, has an influence on what they chose to put in. And the fact that they were choosing from different sources would tell us that most probably they were also in different places. Did they know each other? There's a good chance that Matthew was writing within Judea, whereas Luke was possibly writing from outside in the Hellenistic world or the Roman world. So again, how widespread was Christianity? How widespread was the writing down of these sources? Of course, the problem for us is that these sources of L and M and Q are not mentioned in any other external source, so a source outside of the Bible. They're not mentioned there, and yet if they were that important that they would be used by the gospel writers, then why aren't they mentioned anywhere? And why haven't we found fragments of them? We don't know. And this is one of the most important things for you as a student of the New Testament you're going to have to come to terms with, is that you're going to keep hearing people say, we don't know. We don't know the dates of the Gospels. We don't know who really wrote them, because none of them are ascribed to a particular person. So it's not like Galatians where Paul writes, I, Paul, an apostle. Nowhere does it say, I, Mark, a disciple, or I, Matthew, a disciple. It doesn't come to that. What we realize is that the gospel writers are anonymous. And so we've got to go with history to actually say who wrote these. when they wrote them, and in why they wrote them. And that means that what we've got to do is we've got to use the concept of inference. We've got to infer. And so what we do is we make the best understandings we have, and then from that we infer. We then deduce from what we read and from what we understand the rest of our argument. But that means that we always need to hold on to our arguments very lightly, because the truth is that we don't know. What we do know, and this is a very important part of the issue of the synoptic problem, is that what we need to work on is to say that there were different sources, there were different times, there were different writers, and each of them used a different reason for putting them together. In our next clip, we're going to look at how we respond to the synoptic problem. But you can see that there's lots of possibilities in terms of how that synoptic problem actually worked. Who wrote the Gospels and when they were written really is still part of the debate. How many sources they have is still part of the debate. There's a chance that in fact neither Q nor M nor L existed. And what existed instead was a rich oral tradition. And that what these writers did was, by virtue of their association with the early disciples and so on, they actually used that oral tradition to actually develop their Gospels. Exactly which one or how it works for us is something we have to continually keep studying, to keep learning, to keep growing within the Gospels, to understand that there is so much that we do not know. Helps us to actually keep studying and keep connecting with what we can know and what we can infer out of that.